All right, this first session we're going to talk about millions of years, the idea's origin and its impact on the church. We see in textbooks and in museums sometimes geological time scale, a chart that shows how the history of life developed on this planet. And you have the very simple bottom-dwelling sea creatures at the beginning of the rock record, and then as you come up through the rock record, you have fish and amphibians and reptiles and eventually mammals and people. And according to the evolutionists, this history of life represents, from the first single-celled creature up to the present, 1.9 to 3.8 billion years. And those billions of years just roll off people's tongues like it's talking about yesterday. But where did that idea come from? Well, before we look at the history of this idea and its impact, I want to draw your attention to two verses of Scripture that are very relevant to this topic. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." So Paul says that we as Christians are involved in a war. And it's not a war of spears and chariots and arrows or missiles and bullets. It's a war of ideas. Ideas, he says, that are speculations. The King James translates that Greek word imaginations. And these are high and lofty ideas that are raised up against the knowledge of God, and therefore raised up against His Word, which is where we get the knowledge of God. So we're in a war. Secondly, in Colossians chapter 2, Paul says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ." Now, Paul didn't give warnings in vain. He knew that there was a very real possibility that Christians could be taken captive by philosophy, philosophical ideas that are really empty deceptions and the traditions of men, and that are contrary to Christ, and therefore, again, contrary to the Word of Christ. Now, as we go through the history, what we're going to see is that this is exactly what has happened to the church on this question of millions of years. The church has been deceived by high and lofty ideas that are really philosophical and empty deceptions. The idea of millions of years was not developed by one person. It wasn't one book like Darwin's book that brought the idea. It was a number of people that contributed to this over about a 60-year period. Comte de Buffon was a French scientist and naturalist, and he wrote a book in 1778 in which he imagined or speculated that the earth was once a hot molten lava ball, and it cooled over about 78,000 years to become the planet that we live on today. His private writings, his unpublished writings, actually show that he believed the earth was at least 3 million years old, but even 78,000 was not acceptable to the Roman Catholic Church at the time. Laplace was an astronomer, and he developed a theory based on the imagination or speculation that the solar system was once a huge spinning gas cloud. It slowly cooled and condensed according to the laws of physics and chemistry, and it became the solar system that we live in today. And this became known as the nebular hypothesis, and it took long ages for this to happen. Jean Lamarck was another French scientist, and he developed a theory of biological evolution in his book that he published in 1809, 50 years before Darwin. But at the time that he published the book, most scientists did not accept the idea of biological evolution. They believed in creation of living things. But the idea of millions of years was taking hold. Now, none of those men were geologists. Abraham Werner was a German mineralogy professor, and he was writing in the late 18th century, and he imagined, again, he didn't observe this, but he imagined that the sedimentary rock layers, like we see in the Grand Canyon especially, but are all over the earth, were the result of a slowly receding global ocean over about 1 million years. That was a speculation. That was his imagination based on his study of sedimentary rocks near his home in what is now southeast Germany. Up in Scotland at the same time was a man named James Hutton, and his view became known as Uniformitarianism. He believed that the continents were gradually being eroded into the ocean by the wind and the rain, eroding the top surface of the continents, carrying that into the rivers, and then the rivers carried the sediments down to the ocean, dumped them on the ocean floor. The internal heat of the earth hardened those into rock, and then they would be raised by some convulsion to become new land masses. So he saw earth history as cyclical. The continents were being eroded into the ocean, and the ocean floor was being lifted up to become new continents, to be eroded into the ocean, to be eventually lifted up. And so he said, I can see no evidence of a beginning in the rock record. He didn't pay much attention to the fossils, neither did Werner, but Cuvier was a French scientist, Georges Cuvier, who was very interested in fossils. He was a paleontologist and comparative anatomist, and he developed a theory as he looked at the rock layers in the Paris Basin, in and around Paris, and the fossils in those layers. He imagined that the earth had suffered many regional or global catastrophic floods that wiped out most or all of the creatures at the time, buried many of them in sediments. They became fossils, and then life recovered from that event with or without some supernatural creation of creatures. And then there was another catastrophic flood after a long period of time. And then the earth recovered from that, and some fossils were formed, and then there was another catastrophic flood of global or continental proportions. So that view became known as the catastrophist view. And then William Smith was an English geologist. He was actually a drainage engineer and surveyor, but he developed the method of using fossils to date the rocks. So if he found a rock layer over in Wales with a certain kind of fossil in it, and he found the same rock layer over in England, even if they weren't physically connected, if they had the same fossil, they were the same age. And that method of dating the rocks is still used today. And he was a catastrophist like Cuvier, so he believed in these multiple catastrophes over long ages. And then finally, Charles Lyell, who was born the year that Hutton died, and he built on the ideas of Hutton and really was the one who developed the Uniformitarian view, which is that all of the processes of geological change going on in the world today, erosion, sedimentation, volcanic activity, earthquake activity, those processes have always worked in the past at the same rate and frequency and power that we see today. And that is a gradual change in the earth over long, long ages. So these ideas all came together to develop two views of earth history, and then there was one other view that had been dominant in Europe up to that time. So in the early 19th century, you had the catastrophist view, which said that there was a supernatural beginning. All the catastrophists believed in a God, so they believed there was a supernatural beginning to the world and a supernatural beginning to created life. But then life went along for a long period of time, and there was a catastrophic flood of a global or continental proportion that wiped out most or all of the creatures living at that time. God either created new creatures or the survivors repopulated the earth, and life went along for a long period of time, and there was another catastrophic flood that wiped out most or all of the creatures. And then with the help of miracles or just the recovery of surviving life, the earth got repopulated. And then after a long period of time, there was another catastrophic flood. And this happened many, many times, according to these catastrophists, leading up to the present time. Now, some of the catastrophists believed that the last catastrophe was Noah's flood. But many of them believed that these catastrophes were before man was even created. That view dominated geology for about 3 decades, the first 3 decades of the 19th century. But it was replaced by the Uniformitarian view of Hutton and Lyell. And from their writings, we can't tell if they believed in a creator or not. Their writings are a little bit obscure. So they may not have believed in a supernatural beginning or even a beginning at all. And on their timeline, there are no seas, because they insisted that there have never been any floods any bigger than what we have today on average. So a little flood there, a little flood there, a little flood there, every so often, yes. But no continental scale floods, no global floods in Earth history. And everything in the geological record can be explained by time and chance and the laws of nature over millions of years. Now, those two views were competing against the view that the church had believed for 18 centuries, the biblical traditional view. It was defended by a group of men that I studied in my Ph.D. research called the Scriptural geologists. And they believed in a supernatural creation week, SCW, of 6 literal days of creation, just as Genesis describes. And they believed that about 1,600 years after that was the flood of Noah, which these scriptural geologists, many of them were studying the rocks, believed that the geological record was evidence of that flood. And then the earth recovered from that event up to the present time. And this whole period of history from the creation week to the present was about 6,000 years. The scriptural geologists were defending that view against these developing views of catastrophism and uniformitarianism. But that's not how all Christians responded to these ideas. Many Christians quickly accepted the idea of millions of years and tried to harmonize it with the Bible. And so there was Thomas Chalmers, who was a Presbyterian minister and a naturalist, or what we would call a scientist today of sorts. And in 1804, as a young pastor of 24, he began to advocate in his church the gap theory. He was a very, very gifted speaker, and he began to influence many in the church to accept the idea that we could put all of the millions of years between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis 1. And he insisted that the Bible taught how long man has been in existence, but the Bible didn't say anything about how old the earth is. Other people took a different view. George Stanley Faber was an Anglican theologian, a very respected theologian. And in 1823, he published a book in which he argued for the day-age view, that the days of creation in Genesis 1 were not literal days, but they were figurative days of long periods of time. And some Christians began to adopt the day-age view because of his influence and others. Then there was Hugh Miller. He was a geologist and he was a Scottish Presbyterian layman. He was a friend of Thomas Chalmers. So initially he favored the gap theory. But shortly before his death in 1856, he switched over to the day-age view. And because he was so respected as a Christian geologist, he had a big influence on the church, and many began to favor that view. Now, not only did people have to reinterpret Genesis 1, they also had to reinterpret the flood. They had to do something with the flood. And John Fleming was a Presbyterian minister and a zoologist. And in 1826, he published a journal article in which he argued that the flood was a tranquil flood. It was global, but it was so peaceful, it didn't cause any geological evidence. In fact, it didn't even damage the plants. I don't know anybody that holds that view today, and it wasn't real popular back then either, because a global tranquil flood is kind of an oxymoron. Kind of like talking about square circles. More popular then and today is a view that was advocated by the Congregational theologian John Pye Smith. In 1838, he published a book advocating that Genesis 1 was describing a local creation in the Mesopotamian Valley, and Genesis 6 to 9 was describing a local flood in the Mesopotamian Valley. And it's just described in exaggerated language. And that became a very popular way to treat the flood, if you still wanted to believe that Genesis was historical and that there really was an event called Noah's flood. Those men were all conservative Christians. They would have affirmed that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. But there was one other response to the old earth geology, and that was what the liberal theologians said. Liberal theology had been developing on the European continent since the middle of the 18th century, but it had been kept out of Britain and North America quite a bit because of the influence of the great evangelical awakening under the Wesleys and Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and others. And so the liberal theology started to seep into Britain in the 1820s, and the liberals, of course, said Genesis 1 to 11 is mythology. It's not history. So just like the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians and Egyptians had their creation and flood myths, so did the ancient Jews. These were pre-scientific, primitive, superstitious ideas. So we can summarize then, in the early 1800s, you had these various compromise positions with old earth geology. You had the gap theory becoming popular through the influence of Charles Thomas Chalmers. You had the day-age view and tranquil flood view in the 1820s. You had the local flood and Genesis is myth in the 1830s. And in the midst of all of that were these scriptural geologists, which we would call today young earth creationists. And I discovered 30 writers writing between about 1820 and 1850 who were writing against these various old earth views and the various Christian compromise positions. And one of those men that I studied was George Young, who was a Presbyterian pastor and a geologist. And he was a geologist not only by reading geological works, but he also did a lot of field work, actually going out and studying the rocks and the fossils on location. He wrote 3 books on geology, one in 1822 that was praised by the leading geologists of the day for its accurate description of the rock layers and the fossils, although they completely ignored the end of his book where he gave his theoretical interpretations of what he had so accurately described. They didn't refute his arguments, they just ignored them. Then he wrote 2 books in the late 1830s, Scriptural Geology, an appendix to Scriptural Geology. The second book was a refutation of John Pye Smith's views of a local creation and a local flood. I found other men who also were very knowledgeable in geology, both by actually going out and looking at the rocks and the fossils and reading the geological literature of their day. And I talk about those men in this book, The Great Turning Point. So if you'd like to know more about those men and the battle that they were fighting there, that would be a good resource. Now, none of the men who were scriptural geologists and had geological competence by the standards of that day, none of their writings were really responded to by the old earth geologists. They just ignored them. And so when you read history of science about this time period, the secular historians of science will say that this was a battle between scientists and those who were scientifically ignorant. It was a battle between science and religion. But that's not what it was. It was really a battle of philosophies and religions competing against each other. Because if it were really the former, then you wouldn't have had any scriptural geologists who had any scriptural knowledge. They actually did have, and they wrote geological writings that were well informed. The battle was between Christianity and 2 alternative worldviews or religions or philosophies, however you want to describe it. One was Deism. Deism is a philosophy, a religious view that says that there is a God, He's a creator, but He's separate from the creation and He's distant. God created the world way back in the beginning. He started it all up. It was quite simple, but He built into the creation the laws of nature. And then, much like a watchmaker making a watch and winding it up, He just let the world run according to the laws of nature. So in the deistic view, God is way back in the past, and He doesn't do any miracles. because a miracle would be a violation of the laws of nature. So God doesn't interfere with His creation. Well, that means if you're a deist, you don't accept any of the miracles in the Bible. You don't accept that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. You don't accept the incarnation of Christ. You don't accept the sacrifice of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. So it's a religion of good works. And that was growing in popularity as a religious view in the 18th and early 19th century. Another view developing in popularity at this time was atheism. Now, there have always been some atheists in the history of man, but they've been far and few between. Most people that have ever lived on this earth have been religious in some way, believed in some kind of a God. But atheism really started to take hold in France and led really to the bloody French Revolution. And of course, with atheism, there is no God. The universe is the only thing that there is. So then everything must be explained by time and chance and the laws of nature. Now contrast those two views with biblical Christianity. In Christianity, you have something similar to deism in the fact that God is separate from His creation, so that if the universe disappeared, God would still exist. He created the universe. But in Christianity, you also have one other important truth about God, and that is that God is present everywhere in His creation. He is active in His creation. He is upholding His creation by His power, and from time to time He works in His creation in an unusual way, which the Bible calls miracles. Now, in a biblical way of thinking, a miracle is not a violation of the laws of nature, because the laws of nature are not like traffic laws. They're not something God has to obey. Rather, they are descriptive of how He normally controls His universe. And a miracle is just God working in His universe in an unusual way. He's not breaking any laws. So you have deism and atheism competing against biblical Christianity in terms of their views of God and the universe. And so let's summarize then. Historians of science have a pretty good idea what the theology was of those men who developed the old earth thinking. Buffon was either a deist or some kind of vague theist. He might have even been an atheist. It wasn't real popular when he was writing, and so often people would hide their real views living in Catholic France or Protestant Britain. They would hide their real views to be socially acceptable. And so they didn't always say what they were really thinking. Laplace, however, was an open atheist. Lamarck was a deist or an atheist. Werner was a deist or an atheist. Hutton was a deist or an atheist. Cuvier was a deist or a vague theist. He wasn't a biblical Christian. Smith was the same. And Lyell was a deist or a Unitarian, which is basically the same thing. So I want you to notice something. These men were not unbiased pursuers of truth. They had a religious view about God and the universe. There, in fact, is no such thing as an unbiased, objective pursuer of truth. Every scientist who has ever lived has a worldview, has a religious orientation, and that affects how they look at the world and how they understand the world. And these men were holding these views in a continent that was explicitly Christian. So they were consciously anti-Christian in their views. And some of them made their views very clear. Listen to this statement by James Hutton and follow his reasoning. The past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. No powers are to be employed in explaining the history that are not natural to the globe, no action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle. So he says, if we're going to reconstruct the past history of our planet, we need to restrict our explanations to things that are happening now and things that are natural. Well, what has he just ruled out by insisting on that way of reasoning? He's ruled out creation. Creation's not happening now, and creation was not a natural event. It was supernatural. What else has he ruled out? Well, he's ruled out the flood. The flood isn't happening now, and the flood was partially natural because water did flow downhill then like it does now, but it was a supernatural event in that God brought judgment on the world. So he's saying if we're going to reconstruct the history of the earth, we must think present processes that are natural. He didn't come to that conclusion by studying the rocks. He came to that conclusion from his religious worldview. In another place he said, but surely general deluges, by which he meant global floods, form no part of the theory of the earth. For, watch his logic, the purpose of this earth is evidently to maintain vegetable and animal life and not to destroy them. You see what his reasoning is now? He's saying, look at the earth right now. The earth is designed to support plant and animal life. Well, if you just reason from the present to the past, you can see there could never have been a global flood because that's contrary to the purpose of the earth. What's he doing? He's reasoning from the present to understand the past. There's another way to think. You can start with the past to understand the present. He's decided to go from the present to the past, not because the rocks say so, but because of his worldview. Charles Lyell said, I've always been strongly impressed with the weight of an observation of an excellent writer and skillful geologist who said that for the sake of revelation, that is the Bible, as well as of science, of truth in every form, the physical part of geological inquiry ought to be conducted as if the Scriptures were not in existence. That's not an unbiased position. He's saying we need to go out and look at the rocks, and we need to pretend that this Bible doesn't exist. Well, when you do that, then you're also pretending that there never was a global flood. And there never was a creation event. And the Bible's not the earth is not young, as the Bible says. So you're thinking from an unbiblical, or rather an anti-biblical perspective. Again, he's not unbiased, he's highly biased against the Scriptures. So what Hutton and Lyell, and there were others who wrote and revealed their thinking on this, they're all saying the same thing. Back there in the early 19th century, the philosophy that they were promoting for the interpretation of the rocks is what we call today Uniformitarian naturalism. And there are 3 points that are essential to this way of thinking. One is that nature or matter is all that exists. Now, not all scientists are atheists, but that's a statement of atheism. But a lot of scientists who do believe in a God, they do their scientific work as if that statement was true. Secondly, everything can and indeed must be explained by 3 things: time and chance and the laws of nature. If you have those 3 things, time and chance and the laws of nature, these men would say, you can explain everything you see. You can explain the rock layers, the fossils, and eventually Darwin just picked up on the same principles to explain the origin of living things. And then third, with respect to geology, the processes of geological change have always been operating in the past at the same rate, frequency, and power as we see today. Those are the assumptions that took control of geology back at that time. John Hedley Brooke reports on a statement that Lyell wrote, records part of a letter that Lyell wrote to another old earth geologist. And Lyell wrote this: I trust I shall make my sketch of the progress of geology popular, describing his own work on geology. Old Fleming is frightened and thinks the age will not stand my anti-mosaical conclusions, and at least that the subject will for a time become unpopular and awkward for the clergy. But I'm not afraid. I shall out with the whole, but in as conciliatory a manner as possible.